The moderator for the next panel, I'm going to introduce Sarah Gonzalez-Bosinski. Sarah Gonzalez-Bosinski is Director, Economic Security for Survivors Project at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, where she oversees the development of training, tools, and curricula, and provides technical assistance to domestic and sexual violence programs and justice system professionals on strategies to better address the intersections of survivor economic security and safety. Sarah specializes in the creation and implementation of employment-focused curricula, as well as fostering comprehensive community-based support strategies. Sarah has presented at national and regional conferences for domestic and sexual violence advocates and criminal justice professionals. Prior to joining IWPR, she worked at Wider Opportunities for Women, where she advocated for policies that promote economic security for women and girls in the District of Columbia. She received her BA from Colgate University and Master of Public Policy from the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to see you all here today, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel on gender violence and Title IX, an issue that is obviously near and dear to my heart, so I'm thrilled to be working with these wonderful women here who are going to share fantastic information with you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone. We'll go ahead and each speaker will have 10 minutes. We'll do a short moderated discussion with me, because I'm certainly going to have many questions for the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So first, I'd like to introduce Susanna Baruch. She's a consultant focused on women's health and genetic policy. She was previously the Law and Policy Director at the Genetics and Public Policy Center, where she worked on reproductive genetic technologies, included pre-implantation genetic diagnoses. She led the center's work in genetic discrimination laws and policy, including the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Previously, Susanna served as the Director of Health Law Policy at the National Partnership for Women and Families, where she testified before the Senate on genetic discrimination legislation and founded and created the Coalition for Genetic Fairness. She also spent several years on Capitol Hill working on a range of women's reproductive health and discrimination issues for Representative Nita Lowey. Susanna holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School and a BA in History from Yale College. She is the outgoing chair of the Wellesley Center for Women's Council of Advisors. Welcome. Thank you. We are also joined by Jessica Davidson. Jessica Davidson is the managing director of End Rape on Campus. She is a graduate of the University of Denver, where she worked as student body vice president and gained national attention for her innovative programs and policy reform. Jess worked on the Obama White House in the fall of 2016 as an intern in the front office team as a senior advisor to the president with Valerie Jarrett. Jess was named an It's On Us White House Champion of Change in April 2016, and an honor that was given to 10 campus leaders across the United States, and she's now an advisor to the It's On Us project. Thank you, Jessica. And Nan Steen. For over 30 years, Nan is a senior research scientist at the Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College and conducted research on student-to-student sexual harassment in K-12 schools, teen dating violence, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence. As a former middle school teacher, drug and alcohol counselor, the gender equity specialist with the Massachusetts Department of Education since joining Wellesley in 1992. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Justice, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the U.S. Department of Education. She has authored many book chapters, law review, academic journals, as well as commentaries in the mainstream media on educational press, often serves as an expert witness on Title IX and sexual discrimination harassment suits. Her work has been recognized by several federal agencies, including the White House. In 2007, she received the Outstanding Contributions to Education Award from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where she received her doctorate. So, welcome to our panelists. I'd like to open it up by turning it over to Susanna.
Thank you very much. I remembered how to turn my mic on. It's my first test. My field is in women's health, and I think I was placed on this panel in part because of the broader topic that today's conference is meant to address, which is women's health and safety and wellness. And we've heard a little bit about that this morning already from our keynote speaker and from the previous panel. And I want to sort of broaden our perspective a little bit, I've worked in women's reproductive health and related issues for almost 25 years in Washington. And one of the things I would say is that as human beings, we're actually able, amazingly enough, to sort of hold different beliefs in our head at once, two different ideas. Psychologists talk about this as cognitive dissonance sometimes, and I sort of want to ask us to engage in that a little bit today, because in today's policy climate, I think it's impossible not to spend most of our time trying to fight back what's happening. And at the same time, I think it's equally important that we think more broadly about the world we would want to live in and the place we are actually trying to go in the long run. This too shall pass can be the mantra of the day, even when it doesn't feel that way. And I'm going to sort of ask us to engage in that a little bit today. There's no way to describe what's happening now other than seeing women's health as being targeted pretty directly. There have been, as everybody here knows, proposals that target women's access to health care, which includes access to contraception, abortion services, maternity care, cancer screenings, STD treatments, osteoporosis screenings, and well women exams that, in an ideal world, include screening for domestic violence. We also know that all populations that might be a bit more vulnerable, low-income women, immigrants, domestic violence survivors, women of color, elderly women, LGBTQ women, all of these women will be hit particularly hard, and we have to keep that in mind. But we're going to spend plenty of time just looking around the room. I know we are all going to spend plenty of time fighting those changes, and I want to ask you to think about what it would look like to create a broader possibility for women's health and wellness. I want to talk about research related to women's health. Back in the 1990s, I worked for Representative Nita Lowey, and we used to talk a lot about women's health research. She was fighting very hard even then to make sure that women were included in health research. Too often, the results of clinical trials only applied to male patients. And we would joke that, you know, even the lab rats were male. Now, that was 20 years ago, but it turns out it was no joke, because it was 2014 before NIH researchers were finally told that they had to make sure that their experiments using rats or pigs or dogs needed to include both males and females. Now, I want to say the reality is that well-meaning researchers had to deal with aspects of biological sex differences that were, to them, essentially inconvenient. The hormones of menstrual cycles made it more difficult to tease apart cause and effect, to look at side effects, to understand what women's patients' experiences would actually be. But inconvenient or not, every one of us deserves to be included in and benefit from high-quality, equitably designed medical research. So I want to say that even in the face of unprecedented proposed cutbacks in access to health care and in health research, we need to continue to work to make sure that research is inclusive and equitable, and that human beings of all sexes and genders and races and ethnicities benefit from the medical breakthroughs that we're seeing. Now, communities of color have very real concerns about being research subjects. Distrust of the medical system is entirely understandable given the history of coercive practices, and there's a lot of that history. We have a long way to go before it is actually a comfortable thing for everyone to trust the system and volunteer for a clinical trial or even try a new therapy in our own pursuit of health and wellness. But what sense could it possibly make to have a system that excludes entire groups from research, which essentially guarantees that the excluded groups won't be able to benefit from the knowledge that we're all seeking? And I want to focus, because it's a particular interest of mine, on a particularly hard case, which is the lack of inclusion of pregnant women in medical research. So for pregnant patients, and some of you may have experienced this, good information about the risks and benefits of medical treatment during pregnancy is hard to find. And patients are typically told by healthcare providers that given the limited research, the best approach is to just say no to all medications, no matter what the mom's need might be. But we know that moms and newborns alike are healthier and better off after appropriate disease management during pregnancy. But at the same time, because of the unwillingness or inability, because of laws and restrictions, to include pregnant women in clinical trials, it's a hard issue to get to the bottom of. And the result is that common conditions that women struggle with, such as diabetes, HIV, hypertension, psychiatric conditions, and autoimmune diseases, are often poorly managed during pregnancy. Depression and anxiety, in fact, are showing up as by far the most common example of conditions that make women feel backed into a corner during pregnancy. And we know that choosing to go off medication in an effort to protect a pregnancy, and thus being depressed and anxious during pregnancy, are a recipe for disaster. It's a situation ripe for problems, and it increases the risk of postpartum depression as well. And a few years ago, in a project I worked on, I had the opportunity to interview some women who had gone through this dilemma firsthand. And what I've come to think, and it's something that echoes some of the comments this morning already, is that in an age of revolutions in data sharing and social media and being watched in our every move, most women felt, quite rightly it seemed to me, that it seems absurd to argue that we can't study pregnant women and their experiences more. If a doctor or a practice saw hundreds of women a year who were deciding whether or not to stay on a particular medication, couldn't what those doctors observed or what those women's experience was at least be discussed or collected? And I think the reality is that women in all situations, in all walks of life, in all communities, understand that the science and evidence that we are engaged in is important to their own health and wellness. The issue isn't whether women are going to benefit from these advances. The issue is really how we are going to make it happen. So I want to say two quick things more about pregnant women and the research that it would take, because I think it will illustrate that these are hard dilemmas that are faced. To really understand what's going on during pregnancy, there are both sort of political and societal barriers in our way. We know remarkably little about the early embryonic development that happens in a pregnancy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's hard to study, but one of the reasons it's hard to study is that since 1996, there has been an amendment to the annual appropriations bill in Congress that prohibits federal funding from being used for early embryo research. And as a result, we know much less than we could, not just about pregnancy, but about helping women become pregnant, about new methods of contraception, and about early techniques of abortion. We need to think about a long-term strategy to get rid of that federal funding limitation. And the last thing I would say we need to know more about in thinking about this specific problem is hormones. And as a perimenopausal person who is finding this process very shrouded in impenetrable mystery, this is an area ripe for more research. If you want to know how and why pregnant women are affected differently by medication, or how and why women generally are affected by medication and treatments, you need to think about hormones. For women who are considering taking hormones, either for contraception or because they are trying to become pregnant, or because they are considering becoming egg donors, or they are considering the new technique of freezing your eggs in order to delay childbearing, which is sort of being offered up as a solution to the work-family balance problem, or wondering about hormone replacement therapy. All of these areas of medical science lack the sort of basic understanding that we need to know about the benefits and risks of adding hormones to our systems. So I've taken us a long way from Trump Care, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, at another time. But I wanted to say I think the cognitive dissonance is necessary for all of us to keep up our energy and our passion for doing this work, to be able to think more broadly about the big picture and imagine what the future might hold us. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Davidson, who is the Assistant Managing Director of End Rape on Campus.
Thank you so much. Good morning. So after taking that kind of wider view of women's issues and health and this intersection that we'll be discussing on the panel today, I'm going to take a more narrow view on Title IX and campus sexual assault, because that's the nature and premise of my organization. And I have a very interesting view of the past 5 years of the campus sexual assault movement because I was a first-year student at the University of Denver in 2012, before the hunting ground had come out, before it was common knowledge on college campuses that students have Title IX rights. When I entered, I did not know I knew what consent was, but I had never actually heard it in an educational context, either in my high school or in my university setting. I did not know what Title IX rights were and what they meant for me as a young woman starting on a college campus. All I really knew about preventing sexual assault for my friends and I was to walk home in a group when going home from parties or bars, which is not exactly a great solution. So that was in 2012, and I like to couch the stages of the movement by talking about a particularly interesting experience leaving my campus and coming back 6 months later and feeling like I was on two completely different campuses. So in the spring of 2014, I studied abroad I was getting ready to study abroad in South Africa. And there was a case of campus sexual assault involving a very prominent athlete on my campus. And we were watching a student, the victim, being just absolutely torn to pieces on social media, on an anonymous app called Yik Yak. People were writing her name on walls on campus. It was horrifying watching people tell her that she needed to leave because she was standing up for herself as a victim of a violent crime and trying to pursue her Title IX rights as a student on campus. Then in the fall of 2014, the Obama White House launched the It's On Us campaign, and the film The Hunting Ground was starting to get talked about quite a bit. When I came back in January of 2014, I was on a completely different campus from the one that had been pushing this woman out. We had a screening of The Hunting Ground. That was the only time I've ever seen a room, on my college campus be standing room only. I ran for student body vice president, and every student that I talked to said, okay, well, what's going on with this sexual assault thing? I keep hearing a lot, but I don't really know what all of this means. And by the time that I started as student body vice president, more than 200 students had come to me and said, we really need to do something about this. And I was on a campus of 5,000, so that was pretty significant for a relatively inactive campus. And I started to realize that over the course of the White House launching the It's On Us campaign, over the course of this public awareness coming to students about what their rights were, we had really created a space on campus for students to come forward and say, this happened here, this happened to me, I know that I have rights, and how can I pursue them? And the way that emboldened students was truly incredible, to take power back over their education. And we look at Title IX at my organization and campus sexual assault as a health issue and also as a civil rights issue. And having those dual perspectives, I think, really help students to feel empowered to take control of their experience after it's happened to them. This is particularly poignant in the space of campus sexual assault or sexual assault in general, when the crime is by nature taking power away from the victim. It is designed to remove autonomy and agency. And the movement around Title IX and campus sexual assault over the last 5 years in particular has given a lot of power back to the victims of this crime. So to give kind of that background on how we've seen the movement, I'll now add my role into it. So I was student body vice president from 2015 to 2016, and I was doing this work on my campus. And to further exemplify the space that had been created for students, I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post about my own experience with campus sexual assault and how it could be used to illustrate the need for better consent policies, particularly affirmative consent, which is the idea that only yes means yes instead of no means no, or silence means yes. Only an affirmative yes means yes. And so I wrote this piece, and it was under I talked about the policy by telling a story of how my assailant had said, it was a fun hookup. And so I used that idea of saying maybe he doesn't know. He did know, but that wasn't particularly relevant for the story. What I was saying was that we have such bad definitions of consent on college campuses that people can get away with believing or pretending that they don't know that they've committed a crime or that a crime has been committed against somebody. The article went absolutely viral. So here I am, a student body vice president, just trying to get 200 or 300 students talking on my campus about this, and next thing I know, I'm on the front page of the Huffington Post. And seeing how many people nationally reached out to me and were saying, this happened to me too, we're not talking about this, or saying, I don't know who to go to, but this happened to me as well. I saw another example of how many students were really waiting for the floodgates to unleash. They were right behind the gates just waiting so that they could come out and speak about this and talk about it. So that's kind of how I got involved in the national scene and recognized by the Obama White House, and then went on to intern for senior advisor to the president, Valerie Jarrett, and her front office team there, and got involved in the national scene. And when I got involved in that national scene, I started talking to two women named Annie Clark and Andrea Pino about their work and similar experience of coming forward and telling their story. And if you're familiar with the Hunting Ground, you're familiar with them and their work. And then having it just pick up nationally. And so what we see is that students really do want to talk about this. Students do want to address it. They want to have power over this issue, and they want to try and eliminate it on their own campuses. So through getting connected with them and continuing this work on a national level, I then came to become a part of the End Rape on Campus team. And End Rape on Campus was formed out of, if my story is a singular example, take hundreds of thousands of those and the experiences of all of those survivors. And End Rape on Campus is what we created to give students a launching pad to come to talk to help further this movement. And so End Rape on Campus addresses sexual assault with 3 buckets. The first is survivor support. Last year, we spent time with in person or did phone calls with more than 800 survivors directly. We also provide support for secondary survivors, so families, parents, loved ones. And we do everything from just picking up the phone and saying, we believe you, we support you, you're not alone. And sometimes that's all they want. They just want somebody to say, hey, I'm with you and I'm in your corner. Everything from that to helping them file federal Title IX complaints and Clery Act complaints. We run the gamut with letting the survivor choose what they need for themselves and for their family to regain agency. The second bucket that we work on is prevention through education. And we do quite a bit of speaking engagements. We reached, our staff of 5 reached more than 40,000 people in person last year. We visited 29 states, 3 countries, and 44 campuses. So we spend quite a bit of time on the road, and we find that this is incredibly important, not only for survivors to have experts in the field and people that are advocating for them come to the campus and speak in person and see their campus invest money in this. It's empowering for survivors, but it's also important for students who maybe have not been directly touched by the issue or don't know that somebody in their life has been directly touched by the issue, and they want to get involved, but they're not certain how. And so when we do those speaking engagements, sometimes it's with other survivors, sometimes it's to a general campus audience, sometimes it will be fraternities who know that they need to address the issue, but they're not sure quite how. And then the third bucket that we work on is policy reform. We've been involved in everything from writing the Campus Accountability and Safety Act to helping advise campuses on their own internal policies to helping with state legislation. We actually just had 2 very big wins in Texas that we're excited about, and also preventing bills that would harm survivors from coming through legislatures. We also just did that in Texas, or if you've been following Georgia House Bill 51, you're also familiar. So I'm going to kind of stop there. I'm really excited to take questions, but I wanted to give you that perspective on what we do and my experience and how I've kind of witnessed this as a student and now as an advocate, and I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And finally, we have Nan Steen, who's the senior research scientist, Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College. Thank you.
Hi. I am the embodiment of climate change, having allergies in the spring for the first time in my life. And I'm way postmenopausal, so I'm not getting this confused with menopause. But so if you hear me coughing, I'm not sick. This is just climate change coming through me. Before I get to the substance of my talk, I want to go through, I want us to go backwards in time more than 35 years and to give some historical context to the problem of sexual harassment in K-12 schools. And thinking about the women lately from Fox News who've spoken out about sexual harassment, or not so long ago when the women from Walmart stood at the Supreme Court and sued, I'm powerfully reminded of the origins of locating and identifying the problem of sexual harassment and sex discrimination. I would not have found my way to this problem in the late 1970s were it not for the larger feminist movement that identified the structural inequalities and injustice of sexual harassment and sex discrimination in the workplace. As labor historian, lawyer, and Smith College professor Carrie Baker has written in her book, it's called The Women's Movement Against Sexual Harassment. The movement against sexual harassment had it emerged from multiple feminisms. One was African American women who initiated most of the precedent-setting lawsuits, filing employment discrimination cases with the EEO offices in the early 1970s and turning to civil rights organizations for assistance. The early sexual harassment plaintiffs were the first to conceptualize sexual harassment as sex discrimination under Title VII, thus fundamentally shaping the movement of sexual harassment by grounding it in Title VII sex discrimination law. Additionally, women who entered non-traditional and blue-collar jobs, such as the mines of West Virginia and Minnesota, the shipyards of Jacksonville, Florida, and police forces and construction sites all over the country, broadened the definition of sexual harassment to include hostile environment, not just from supervisors, but also from co-workers as they endured sexual abuse and physical violence in attempts to push them out of the workplace. Moreover, women in the pink-collar sector, typically female occupations like clerical workers and flight attendants, also joined the movement of women's rights in the workplace and raised the issues of sexual exploitation in the workplace. Sleep with me or you'll lose your job or get a better shift. And if you remember the movie 9 to 5 with Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda, and Lily Tomlin, they weren't making this stuff up. These women fought to be treated as professionals rather than as convenient nearby sex objects. And finally, white middle-class women in Ithaca, New York, who formed an organization called Working Women United, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, the Alliance Against Sexual Coercion, formed the first organizations to work on sexual harassment. These women use feminist theory to analyze sexual coercion in the workplace and organize speak-outs, surveys, newsletters, and frequently spoke to the media. And last but not least, the feminist lawyers, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was head of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, litigated the early sexual harassment cases and participated in developing public policy on sexual harassment and establishing the rights of women in the workplace. And I want to give a shout out to the National Women's Law Center. I think there are 2 people here. Are you here, the National Women's Law Center? Yay! Okay. And and their instrumental work in fighting sexual harassment in schools, and particularly to Verna Williams and Deborah Brake, who used to be there, who are now law professors, who argued the first case to reach the U.S. Supreme Court in the K-12 arena in 1999. And I went to the oral arguments and won it 5-4 with Sandra Day O'Connor writing the majority opinion. That was the Davis case that involved a 5th grade girl who was sexually harassed by a 5th grade male classmate. In 1978, when I was a new state employee of the Massachusetts Department of Education, and I like to say hardly a feminist advocacy organization, I learned firsthand of a situation that was taking place among 6 of our student employees who worked in their own student service center. It was a glass-enclosed office in downtown Boston under the nose of the Massachusetts Commissioner of Education. There were 4 girls and 2 boys, and one of the boys was making it difficult for the girls to work. He told dirty jokes, spoke of his imagined or real sexual conquests, would corner the girls up against the wall. They were creeped out by this guy. They couldn't concentrate on their work. They dreaded coming to work and encountering him, and they didn't know what to call this problem. It sounds like sexual harassment in the workplace, right? But nobody in there had the power to fire, hire, promote, nothing. They were all, equivalent kids. So a group of us who worked at the Department of Education decided we would conduct a survey, I was a graduate student at the time, of Massachusetts high school kids, urban, rural, suburban, public, private, and parochial, to determine the extent of the problem. Next, we created a curriculum. Various versions of it came out in 79, 81, 83, and 86. All of these are on my shelves at Wellesley. Pulling together guidance counselors and teachers throughout the state, and we called it Who's Hurt and Who's Liable? Sexual Harassment in Massachusetts Schools. Now, we made up the liability part. because there weren't any court cases yet, but we just knew that there would be. And 20 years later, the Supreme Court agreed with us. Which brings me up to the present, more or less. In 1995, I wrote an article called Sexual Harassment as the Public Performance of Gendered Violence, and it was published in the Harvard Educational Review. And there were 4 key points that I made in 1995. That sexual harassment in schools is behavior that happens in public with witnesses and bystanders, some of whom are adults. Secondly, when sexual harassment occurs in public and these interactions are not interrupted, then permission to proceed is granted and the conduct becomes normalized and legitimized. Third, from student narratives, the students sounded to me like battered women in training because I was doing a big survey through 17 magazine with a colleague, Nancy Marshall, at Wellesley. And it was in the September 92 issue of 17 magazine, and 4,300 girls wrote back. Now, magazine surveys are not scientific, but neither is a lawsuit. It's a sample size of 1. So, and I decided in 1992 that I was going to find lawsuits that sounded like what the girls were saying, and I had no trouble finding parallel kinds of lawsuits. So I can't read it because I see Dana flicking these numbers at me. So, but girls learn that nobody intervenes on their behalf, no one believes them, and if they speak up, they're interrogated or blamed. They learn to adjust their behaviors in an effort to change the harasser's behavior. And for boys, it seemed like permission to proceed because the behaviors went unsanctioned. And for boys who were not harassing, when they see the boys who are harassing getting away with it, they might think that they're supposed to engage in this kind of behavior. Why not, since nobody's getting in trouble? But boys who observe sexual harassment will often indicate that they find it scary, troubling, and disruptive to the educational environment. So if you can get away with it in public, then what's to stop you from doing it in private, right? So it just became like this link, which I ended up later doing years of research on teen dating violence and sexual harassment as the precursor. But the 4th point that I made in 95 was that when teachers teach about sexual harassment directly and engaging ways, that kids begin to notice it, they'll talk about it, and they may even intervene in it. Now, we're going forward to 2017. Before I head into sharing some of my concerns, which I hope Dana will let me do, I want to give a shout out and acknowledge now President Obama and Vice President Biden for setting up the Office of the Special Advisor for Violence Against Women. It was in the White House, it reported to Vice President Biden, and Lynn Rosenthal, who held that job for 6 years, is here. So I think we owe Lynn a debt of gratitude for... I hope she'll continue to be the exile office of the, or the shadow government, like the way they do in Britain. So, so I had about 6 points. I'm going to try and say them really fast. That garden variety sexual harassment is gone, that now it's more violent and it's happening at younger ages. I wrote a law review article in 2005 starting to detail how the sexual harassment didn't look in 2005 like it did in the 80s and 90s. It was getting younger and more violent. That incidents of sexual harassment are misidentified and mislabeled by school personnel. They ignore it, minimize it, or cast it as bullying, a more palatable term to the public, and that doesn't put school administrators at risk for a federal lawsuit. 3, that the number of complaints about sexual violence in K-12 schools made to the Office for Civil Rights has been growing. The numbers now, as of May 3rd, were 148 open cases. 3 years ago, when I filed a FOIA request, that's the Freedom of Information Act request to OCR, there were 25 cases pending with OCR. 4th, the definition of sexual harassment is not open to invention or substitution. I see school administrators calling it, they invent these classifications, inappropriate touching, inappropriate sexual contact, or, my nemesis, bullying. Fifth, that most bullying products and interventions do not cover sexual harassment or gender violence and will do nothing to reduce it. Bullying products are just filled with distortions and inventions of behavior that ought to be named as sexual harassment, and yet they're called bullying. And six, that federally sponsored surveys provide spotty and insufficient information about sexual harassment and gender violence in schools. They use a definition in these surveys. These are federal surveys that principals fill out that do not correspond either to what the Supreme Court said as the definition of sexual harassment or the Office for Civil Rights. They have made up a definition. I'm going to read it to you. Unsolicited offensive behavior that inappropriately asserts sexuality over another person. This behavior may be verbal or nonverbal. This is like preposterous to me. What does asserting sexuality have to do with a sexual assault, right, or sexual harassment? This is the definition that is in all these federal surveys that collect information about sexual violence and gobs of other behaviors in schools. And that the data that they do collect when they aggregate gender violence information with physical violence so that a fight on the playground gets aggregated into the same category as sexual violence, thus kind of washing it out and minimizing it. So I'm ending now, Dana. Finally, if you take nothing else away from my remarks, please let's name sexual harassment and gender violence accurately. If it's sexual harassment, let's call it that. If it's homophobia, let's call it that. Please stay away from the temptation to impose zero tolerance. Let's put the onus on school personnel by requiring them to be zero indifferent to sexual violence and sexual harassment, and have a commitment to comment, act upon, and speak up when they see sexual harassment happening among students. And please keep the pressure up on OCR and the U.S. Department of Ed, and activism, activism, activism. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's please give another round of applause for our entire panel. Thank you very much. So we have approximately, I believe, half an hour for questions. 20 minutes? Okay, even less than I thought. So I'll ask one kind of overarching question real quick, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. There's a little bit of a theme of challenging the norms and disrupting them throughout all of your presentations. And I was wondering what each of you might recommend as making the best case. What have you seen work? How can we start to disrupt those norms and make sure women have access by getting data on women during pregnancies and making sure that you've had a lot of success in the last 5 years. It's a very short amount of time to start turning things around on campuses. What is the best approach for us to consider moving forward?
I think what I have seen in what I'll call the reproductive rights, health, and justice movements over the last 25 years that has been most disruptive in the best possible way is a trend towards listening to women and trusting women and hearing their individual stories and bringing those stories to the policymakers or whoever needs to hear them. And I think that's a theme we've heard a little bit throughout today, is that the individual lives of women are what matters the most, and not to quite literally whitewash those stories, not to assume that one woman can speak for all women or any version of that you might care to come up with, but to make sure that we are all listening to each other and inclusive in every way.
Absolutely. Three things come to mind. The first is what we like to call everyday activism. In a society that encourages our citizens to do anything but believe survivors of sexual violence, to ask, what were you wearing? Did you say no? How many times did you say no? Well, why did you go home with them? Instead of asking those questions, choosing to believe survivors, always, period, no qualifier, to believe survivors is actually an incredibly radical act. And the first time I heard that, I was like, well, I don't know about that. That's because in my circles, it's not a radical act. But in our society, it is an extremely radical act. And calling it out when you see other people not doing it, choosing to do it yourself, stopping yourself from questions when you read articles that could be deciding not to believe the survivor, but instead just choosing to believe them, is actually a form of activism, though we don't think about it. Thank you. The second that comes to mind is, I think you hit on it very well with whitewashing. You know, many of the stories that we see about survivors of sexual violence, or especially on college campuses, they're people who look like me. It's the white student body vice president. And that's not the story of the majority of people who experience sexual assault. We don't hear very many stories of people of color. We don't hear very many stories of disabled students. We don't hear very many stories about trans students or homeless students. We need to start hearing those stories. And until people are just as angry about those stories as they are the stories of Jane Doe from the Brock Turner case, until we see that level of outrage for a trans person of color, we are not where we need to be as a movement. And the third and final thing, and this is what we always encourage students to do, and as people who are involved in various touchstones of higher ed, you all have an opportunity to help facilitate this in your community or encourage students to do so and create pathways for them, is for students to really do power mapping on their own campuses and decide how to be activists within that. For me and for my campus, the best way to get the administration to listen when I was trying to get them to change the consent policy was to write a publicly facing article that was outside of our community that would put public national pressure on them. On some college campuses, it's going to be a single donor or a board of trustee member or a professor, but encouraging students and as an outside member in the community, being able to help them sort through this to find the touchstone that can be that power point for them that they can then put pressure on and do good community organizing in order to put that pressure on. That's what's going to create campus change, and campuses are a microcosm of our national reality. And so when we see students on college campuses that are putting that pressure on, we see national conversation and national change.
I'm afraid I forgot the question. I'm a believer in filing lawsuits and filing complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. And I've been doing this project through FOIA requests, which have just, just made me nuts, because OCR won't give you currently pending complaints. They'll only give you the resolved ones, which you can find on the web. So, and actually, I think that there are merits to filing an OCR complaint in kids in K-12. But it's got to be accompanied by a lot of activism by the parents and by the teenagers. It can't just be this isolated thing. See, the difference between the college women and the young women, the kids under the age of 18, is 12-year-olds are not giving press conferences, right? And college women can. They're adults. They can throw their own press conference and see who comes. And so you don't get this galvanization around the preponderance of evidence that looks so similar across the country because it's held so secretly, right? It's just really quiet. And, I can read all kinds of articles in the popular press that the journalists will often get to the fact that there was, a sexual assault at a school, but then you can't get to the kids, or the parent, unless the parents speak about it. So it's very frustrating to see, what are the commonalities across the country. So that's why I believe in lawsuits, because any lawsuit material can come out a lot quicker than actually OCR material. But you have to find good lawyers, and ones like the ACLU Women's Rights Project or the National Women's Law Center, the pro bono lawyers, to be able to reach everybody who can't necessarily afford their own attorney. The advantage of OCR, or the previous OCR as we used to know it, we'll see what happens currently, is that it's free. You don't have to hire them. I mean, they come free, and the kinds of resolutions can include things like paying for counseling, paying for alternative transportation. So there's a distribution of money. It just doesn't come personally to the aggrieved person, but they can stipulate a lot of things. And then there are the lawsuits that the Justice Department steps into, which is like having the 500-pound elephant show up, or gorilla, whatever it's called, So when DOJ decides, when the Civil Rights Division of DOJ decides that they're going to take a case, that makes a world of difference than just OCR, which is the Department of Education. So in any event, I'm not actually a lawyer, but I'm somebody who believes that we have to kind of shove the law in a lot of other people's faces.
Thanks. I saw that hand first. Just not sure where the mics are. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much to the speakers. Very interesting panel. I have two questions. The first one is for Susanna about research. I found your presentation really interesting, and I'm curious about if there's similar trends with regards to breastfeeding. I am the mother of 2 young children, and when I was pregnant with my first, I was really surprised at how much the research on breastfeeding is largely behavioral and cultural, and not medical or biological, and how there's a real lack of research there. And I was wondering if that was just my reading or if that's a broader trend, and if so, why? My second question is very different. It's about sexual harassment, and I'm wondering if there's any sort of trend or movement towards the need to have some sort of reconciliation process for men who were who 20, 30 years ago, it was a different time, maybe they weren't directly involved, but they perpetuated it. And I'm thinking in particular of Joe Biden and how he's often going around these days talking about the initiative that he started with Barack Obama and speaking about consent, and yet remembering him leading the panel against Anita Hill, and just the way the complete undignified way he treated her, shamed her, and I don't think he's ever apologized for that. So the need for that to happen. Thank you.
I think that's a terrific question about breastfeeding. I think if I were to try to answer it, it would be mostly speculative. I mean, certainly in the same way that the process of pregnancy creates changes in sort of our systems, and so any questions about treatment or management of conditions are sort of wrapped up in the way we as a society sort of imagine the mother as the vessel for this future child. The same would be true during the breastfeeding process, and I have to imagine that that affects the extent to which research is happening. I also think that there's a lot of women for whom breastfeeding isn't easy, and so the notion of that being a time when you would be volunteering to be as part of a research project, that sounds just like an additional challenge to me, but certainly one that would be worthwhile to look at. I'm interested, so thank you for asking that question.
I don't know of movements to get retroactive apologies, 30 years later, because I would want them from a lot of those senators. I wouldn't single out Biden, because there was Arlen Specter and there was Simpson from Wyoming. I mean, they were all equally bad to me. And I think that'd be a great question to pose to Anita Hill. I mean, that may be who it matters to the most. There certainly is a movement of conflict resolution on college campuses. I'm not exactly a supporter of it, or even in public schools where I've seen it too. But there are people that I trust, who I respect on college campuses who are working on these circles of whatever they call them, to get apologies happening. And I think insights that come along with some kind of punishment is terrific. I don't want this to become the vehicle of exemption for being responsible for your behavior. So, that's all I know, is that there is indeed a trend to work on this now. What do they call it? What is it called?
So it's called restorative justice.
Thank you. Yes.
And actually the model that was used in Rwanda after the genocide has been extremely impactful and effective in communities there. There are also models of it being done in the United States. Obviously, there are cultural differences. Organizationally, what we advocate for is that the resolution should be survivor-led, trauma-informed, and whatever the survivor wants. And so if a survivor feels that restorative justice would be a meaningful process for them to heal, then we we trust and believe the survivor that they know what's best for them and that they should be able to pursue that. What that means, though, is that if that's going to be offered to the survivor and the survivor feels it would be meaningful for them and elects to do so, the college campus has to have the right tools to do this. And this is not the same as sitting, the survivor and the assailant down and having a Title IX coordinator moderate a conversation. That's not restorative justice, and we have seen that on college campuses where they try that. That can actually be extremely re-traumatizing for the survivor and is not a good practice. There are college campuses where this has been really successful, and again, we say that the survivor should get to lead, make the decision, and advocate for what they wish, and we support them in doing that, and we ask that campuses have the infrastructure to provide that for the survivor.
And being the historian on this panel, so Janet Reno, who was Bill Clinton's Attorney General, was very into peer mediation. And so high schools all over the country had these peer mediators who were trained. And they would do exactly what you said they shouldn't be doing. The peer mediator would get the two parties involved and try to negotiate this, and the adults would be outside the room. Give me a break, because this would deteriorate into a popularity contest. It would deteriorate into shouting. And so, it was, and also you had to question who were the kids that were choosing to become peer mediators, right? And why, right? So, this was before the term restorative justice was used. It was called peer mediation. And there was money put into it under the Clinton administration, who did a lot to militarize high schools, by the way, and put cops in schools, was under Bill Clinton. Not social workers in schools, it was police in schools. So in any event, peer mediation was sort of the soft side of that, but I don't hear much about that anymore.
I do want to push back on that and clarify a little bit, though, because I think, even though peer mediation in high schools and middle schools may have been an attempt at restorative justice, that's not true restorative justice. And what restorative justice means for those in the room who are not familiar is that both parties get to decide together what the victim of the crime needs in order to move forward and have, and sometimes it's done as a community with an entire circle, but on college campuses, we usually see the survivor says, okay, for me to feel better about this moving forward, my assailant needs to leave my classes, or my assailant needs to apologize to me, or needs to go volunteer, whatever it is, the victim gets to decide, and it's a decision made collectively. So it's not, like you said, a popularity contest, peer mediation, that's not true restorative justice.
You got to go to the other side, too, because there's a guy with the microphone
Thank you.
on the other side.
I wanted to ask the panel, as Jessica kind of alluded to, this question of violence against women, goes way beyond students and campuses. So, it's a part of the patriarchal ethos, I guess I would say, in this country. How much of your research, especially Ms. Stein at Wellesley or any of you that can speak to this, is looking at this question in the communities, particularly in the African American or Latina, Native American, and Asian communities, or within the working class? How are we looking at this question now of violence against women? What's your research showing? Is it up to date on that? And, as policy, how it can be addressed? So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that if people have some thoughts on it. Thank you.
Well, when you write research proposals, you have to be really specific. And the kind of research proposals that I write and the kind of expert that I am is in K-12 schools. I have some research projects now in higher education, though. There's, an abundance of work about violence against women in the larger community as well, but that's not something that I've ever done.
I have not done research on this. I'm 23, but but I think I can speak to some of what we've seen and what we consider best practices. The guidance that the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education has put out, and the way that campuses have adopted that, and some of the campuses that we look to now as best best practice benchmarks, a lot of those are predominantly white institutions. And so the culture on their campus around what they've done, there's procedural things that will look pretty similar from place to place. But when we talk about awareness and education and how we're reaching people, a lot of those best practices taking place on predominantly white institutions are not going to look the same at an HBCU or I come from Denver, Colorado. It's not a very diverse place. And so what worked on my campus, which only had 4% of students were African American, are going to look extremely different than an HBCU. Additionally, predominantly white institutions need to be extremely aware of how those practices and the culture around that can marginalize students of color who are already more at risk for these crimes. And so, I think just being really cognizant of who the campus or the greater, you're asking for beyond campus. So in a workplace, in a municipal policy setting, whatever it is, I think we really need to be considerate of, okay, what are best practices? And then how is that actually realistic in our community? Community members know their communities best. And so they need to be the ones to look at these model policies and then decide what's going to be best for the community.
And I should add, with our Economic Security for Survivors project at IWPR, we look at a lot of the research that's being conducted in the field. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data out there that really looks at the needs and the best practices around marginalized communities. And we know those needs and remedies need to be different. There are other factors that are contributing to greater economic insecurity when we're talking about specifically our project, but distrust of police officers, for example. There's a lot of other factors that make violence different. And without having that voice from those communities or not having a better sense of what's really working for them, it's really hard for us to move forward and really inclusively address violence at its roots. So I'm going to go way back. Sorry, Alex, making you walk.
So on my college campus, like many, the administration has not been a consistent resource for survivors. Many of my friends who have come forward have been dismissed or silenced or asked accusatory questions like, what were you wearing, what were you drinking? And in addition to what you said about finding ways to put kind of exogenous pressure on an administration, what can we as students do to communicate with our administrations better? What kind of rhetoric, what kind of strategies would you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important question, and honestly, the answer looks different for every campus, every community, every administrator. I would encourage you to form a coalition with other student leaders and try and figure out, okay, we have representatives from the student government who have relationships. We have representatives from, whatever the power organizations are on your campus that have different relationships with administrators. Figure out who's listening. There's always a couple of administrators, a couple of professors who really want to push this work forward, but are not doing it out in the forefront. And if none of that works and you're interested in filing a Title IX case, we at NRAPE on campus can help you with that. And, if you can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights and say, our administration is asking survivors inappropriate questions. Our administration is pushing this under the rug. That's what that office is there for. And, a lot of people have questions about what that looks like in 2017 and under the new administration. And while I certainly cannot speak to the future, we have still seen cases that are being taken, cases are being resolved. We filed a case in September that had resolution in March, and so that is still a viable option. It may not be one that you trust as much, and it's hard to say what will happen in the future, but cases are still being resolved at about the same speed right now.
Hi, I just wanted to say it's a really interesting panel, and it's interesting that in these areas I feel like an even bigger revolution is needed than in economics and politics, but perhaps all the revolutions we need are equal. But I wanted to respond to the person with the question about breastfeeding. The Journal of Women, Politics and Policy has a special issue on breastfeeding, and we have different articles in it that are looking at it from different points of view, critical about the way it is being presented culturally. And when you actually look at the research, it's very hard to see any difference between 6 months of breastfeeding and 12 months of breastfeeding. And yet the Pediatrics Association, whatever they're called, has a recommendation for 12 months. And as you know, we have at best 12 weeks of leave in this country. I mean, the best thing we could do, if we really wanted to promote breastfeeding, which is important for healthy babies and healthy moms, but it's not the only thing that's important. Formula feeding works very well when there are various issues for either the mother or the child. is paid family leave for 6 months. What happens is, of course, women stop. You know, when they have to go back to work, there's so many workplaces that are not accommodating, and breast pumping is not the same as breastfeeding. And so anyway, I just wanted to say you might want to look at that special issue because there's a lot of viewpoints in there. It's a couple of years old, Journal of Women, Politics, and Policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Terry Bergman from the National Association of Workforce Boards, which is totally irrelevant to being here. I had a couple of questions. I was sort of, when we were talking about Joe Biden, the piece that nobody seems to be paying any attention to is that he is very handsy. You see it all the time when he's, you know, with women. You see it on TV. And no one seems to be suggesting that that's inappropriate, that somebody needs to talk to him about that. But what I was really going to focus on is the issue that both of you have, which is the history of people, say, a very famous case of rape at UVA that been backtracked. Nan, you may not know about this because you're in Massachusetts, but recently we had a case here in the area where some male students were accused of raping a female student in high school, and that's been backtracked. I don't know which things are true and what aren't, but my question is around, you tell me I'm supposed to believe everybody, but it appears that that isn't always true. So there's two questions. How, is the believe everybody, but also what is the impact of what appears to be false accusations on the systems that are developed to help people, whether or not people are believed, all of those things. We have to talk about that kind of thing and what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an important question and a tough conversation. When people ask me, okay, you tell me to believe survivors, but there are false cases. Well, yes, there are false cases. The FBI has consistently found that between 92 and 98%, consistently leaning with 98% of all reported sexual assaults, and that does not include the many, many unreported ones, are true. So that means between 2 and 8%, consistently leaning towards 2% of reported cases are false. That is the exact same rate as any other violent crime. Somebody is just as likely to be falsely accused of sexual assault as they are any other violent crime. But people don't walk around and say, I'm really worried that I'm going to be falsely accused of robbery at gunpoint today. We just don't have that narrative. And a lot of that is because of the way that we talk about sexual violence and we sweep it under the rugs. We don't have good definitions of consent. A lot of people don't know what consent is by the time that they start having sex in high school. That's a recipe for disaster. And so, to that end, there is still that 2 to 8%, and I understand that that is looming. That said, as a society, it is not our place to decide whether or not the survivor is telling the truth. That is the job of the system in place. And every time that we perpetuate this idea, because of the regard that false cases are held in, because every time somebody reports, we say, but what about that UVA case? What about that one time? My friend was falsely accused. We defer to that so much more than we defer to the 92 to 98% of the time that survivors are telling the truth. And that's the reason why survivors don't come forward. That's the reason why me and all of my peers get death threats for our work. That's why, survivors get asked, how short was your skirt? What were you wearing? It's true that between 2 and 8% of the cases reported this year will be false. It is not our place to ask the survivor if they're telling the truth or figure it out.
And I think another point to that is wondering, one question that always comes up for me is, well, maybe there's a reason for them to recant. Why are they recanting? Are there pressures that are happening? And we need to address that as well, because it's something that's causing great harm to survivors, and then there's the public perception as well. So that's another part of that aspect. So 2 more questions. I'm going to go lady in the blue.
Good morning or good afternoon. I was just telling the first panelist that I represent probably 5% of the Asian community here this morning, so I'd like to emphasize that, but thank you for. I come from a subservient country, and going back to what you said earlier about Senator Biden, the women slaves that came to America, the Japanese government actually apologized for that. But because of the subservience of our women, even people that work for a 500 Fortune company, they don't think that they're being violated because they're ashamed and it's whitewashed. Is there a data for Asian women that actually said that they've been sexually abused or verbally abused? Thank you.
You'd have to look at workplace studies on that. I mean, what Jess and I focus on is educational environments, and there are lots of data. I mean, the federal government did surveys in the early 80s or 90s about workplace sexual harassment, and it's broken down by ethnicity and race. So there is data out there, but it's not what any of us up here study. I think we should move on to
Yeah, I will just add a resource, and I know, Linda, you're probably thinking the same thing. The Asian Pacific Gender-Based Violence Institute, I believe they're in Seattle. Thank you. All the acronyms get cut on the left. I believe they're in Seattle. They're in Seattle. They have a lot of great resources for you, and you might be able to connect with Linda, who's right next to you, who have additional ones. Thanks.
I think it's important to say that words matter. So to your point, Nan, I really appreciated everything that you said. And I was actually interested that you weren't a lawyer because I think a lot of times when we talk about sexual harassment, we kind of go to that very narrow definition, and then it leads to exactly what you experienced when you got all those results from principals that said, oh, well, it's just bullying and it's just, verbal harassment. I work on a project at Futures Without Violence that talks about sexual harassment in the workplace, but it's because the way we talk about it is that it's on the spectrum of sexual violence. And I think if we can just take it out of this one little narrow, and I'm saying this as a lawyer, right? Take it out of that one little narrow kind of lane that we then are not minimizing what is really an act of sexual violence. And it's really important to use the correct words.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay. Up front.
Hi. So I have a similar question to one that was asked before about college campuses specifically. So this is mostly directed towards Jessica, and I'm going to try and make it as quick as possible. Thank you. But I actually go to a university that seems to be doing a lot of really good things on the survivor advocacy front, and I just sat on an It's On Us 2.0 task force with our student union, and we have a well-funded survivor advocacy education group. But what I've noticed on my campus is that we're talking about consent in the feminist way, and that it's ongoing, it's continuous, and most importantly, it can't be given if one person is incapacitated. And we count incapacitation by being blacked out by alcohol consumption as part of that. But then the judicial board that deals with sexual assault cases on my campus continuously finds that if somebody comes forth who was blacked out, they find in favor of the perpetrator. And it just seems that their hands are tied. And I feel that we are sort of doing a disservice by not talking about the fact that somebody cannot be giving consent but still not be found in favor of in the institutional judicial board case, and I feel very powerless in dealing with that, and I don't really know how we can best support our survivors when we can't fix the actual case.
Yeah. We see this really frequently on college campuses where one portion of the campus, typically that which provides services to the survivor and the administration, there are lots of pieces to the campus scene when it comes to sexual violence, and so we see this often where they're not all consistently saying the same thing. And that was my issue in trying to get my campus to pass a different consent definition. They had a different definition on the Health and Counseling website as they did the Title IX website. That's confusing to students. We try and use the terminology yes means yes because we think it's easy for students to understand. It encompasses everything that you talked about, and it's also a good way to turn to the administration and say, listen, this is the best way to teach students what consent is. We can't teach them that if this is not what you're going to uphold for them, because that's wrong. We need to get our definition the same across the board. Your administration does have the power to change that definition that the judicial board is using to find that. And I would, be happy to talk with you further about some student activism to get them to do so.
So I want to thank the panel again for this very interesting conversation. Appreciate all your insights. Thank you all for the questions. I believe we're turning next. All right, everyone can stay seated for a little longer. We're going to switch. No? Okay. Now, I just want to take a quick moment to introduce Barbara Galt. Barbara is the Vice President and Executive Director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Her work covers a wide range of issues, including college access and affordability, job quality, paid leave, poverty, political engagement, and the need for better early care and education options for working parents. She founded and leads IWPR's Student Parent Success Initiative and has authored dozens of reports and publications. She has testified in Congress on low-income women's educational access, has spoken and delivered keynote presentations in venues throughout the country, and appears in a wide range of print, radio, television, and media outlets. Prior to joining IWPR, Barbara conducted research at the Office for Children's Health Policy Research and served as a staff and board member of organizations promoting human rights in Latin America. Barbara received her PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA from the University of Michigan. She serves on the board of directors on the Coalition of Human Needs and is a research professor of women's study at the George Washington University. So thank you, Barbara. Turn it over to her.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all the panelists who were so informative and inspiring. My job right now is to introduce Charlotte Burrows, who is currently serving a 5-year term as commissioner at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She has dedicated the vast majority of her career to defending human rights, civil rights, and employment rights. She was nominated to the commission by President Barack Obama in 2014 and confirmed by the Senate very quickly that same year. And as commissioner, among her many accomplishments, she has taken leadership in developing EEOC proposals to help close the gender wage gap by improving access to employer data on wages and encouraging transparency and data collection on men's and women's wages. Prior to her role at the EEOC, she served as Associate Deputy Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice, where she worked on a broad range of legal and policy issues, including employment litigation, tribal justice, voting rights, and implementation of the Violence Against Women Act. It's making me feel encouraged to know that there's someone like this in government right now. Prior to that, there's more. There's even more. She served as general counsel for civil and constitutional rights to Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and was general counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Before working on Capitol Hill, she served in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where she became deputy chief of the employment litigation section after serving as a trial attorney and as special litigation counsel. Before that, she served as a judicial clerk for the Honorable Timothy Lewis of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Third Circuit and as an associate at Debevoise and Plimpton. She received her bachelor's degree from Princeton University and her JD from Yale Law School. So please join me in welcoming Charlotte Burrows.
Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to join you for this terrific conference. Thank you, Barbara, for that generous introduction. Wisdom would dictate that I just sit down and not say anything else, because how can you live up to that? You know, I also wanted to thank Heidi Hartman. It's good to see you, and Beverly Guy-Sheftal, and Layli Marparan, and of course the phenomenal staffs at IWPR, the Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College, and the Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College for bringing us together for this important conference. It's certainly exactly what I need right now. When we gather like this to share our experiences and ideas and our hopes, we can spark really powerful change in this country. And our country needs powerful change right now. Lately, it seems as if every single news cycle brings another announcement about a threat to women's rights. So there's a lot we could talk about, but I wanted to be very disciplined and respectful of your time, particularly since I am between you and lunch. So I really thought, let's not get distracted by all the headlines and focus on what matters, which is the important, thoughtful, and rigorous work that will move our country forward. So just 3 things that I want to talk about. First, the critical importance of research and data for creating sound policy that we need, those of us in government, that we need as a country to make real change for women. Second, what that research shows about how multiple forms of discrimination are limiting women's economic potential. And third, some of what we're doing at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to address these issues. This conference could not come at a more critical moment from my perspective. It's the perfect time to be talking about the importance of research and data. Although these days it sort of feels like maybe we're living in a fact-free alternative reality, don't believe it. Facts matter. Evidence still matters. The work that you are doing matters a great deal because it challenges the gendered and racial barriers that limit women's opportunities and, more broadly, limit our society. We need evidence-based public policy. If we stop our research, if we don't collect data, if we don't rigorously analyze it, take it seriously, we can't understand the problems women face, and we can't find real solutions. It's fitting that today's program takes place in the conference named for Barbara Jordan, who once said, "Education remains the key to both economic and political empowerment." So that goes, in my view, to the heart of what this conference is about, and the heart of all our work, not just today, but every day. We must educate the public and policymakers. Like myself, I'm one of the few that has crossed over into this administration from the past administration, but all of us need that education about the reality of women's lives so that we can work together, armed with knowledge to make a difference in our economic and political worlds. So what does the evidence say about where working women are today? I purposely am going to start with a little bit of good news. Since the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established in 1965, and we collect data and have been doing it since '66, we have really helped open doors of opportunity for women at all levels in the American workforce. As just one example, the percentage of women employed in senior and management positions has increased from less than 10% in 1966 to nearly 40% in about 2013. So that's progress. But we all know that progress is not the same as real equality. So gender discrimination, as well as racial, ethnic, and other forms of discrimination, still hinders women's full equality, not only in the workplace, but in society. As long as that continues, everybody loses, because we lose the benefit of women's full talents and contributions. One important barometer, I think, for the impact of discrimination on women's opportunities is the gender pay gap. It's one of the ways we can tell how close or, frankly, how far away we are from actually realizing women's full potential. Each of the many forms of discrimination women face impacts their paychecks, either directly, as in the case of pay discrimination, which is something we've been working at really hard at the EEOC, or in the case of other forms of discrimination indirectly. Women who are denied hire, training, a deserved promotion, who are steered into lower paying jobs, forced to change jobs because of sexual harassment, or because an employer doesn't think a mother of young children will work hard enough, and I have to add this, or just because she's pregnant. The number of cases we see when a woman comes in and says that she is pregnant and the response is "you are fired" is astonishing. I don't know what I expected that to be before I got to EEOC, but it's shocking to me that anybody doesn't know that's illegal. But it happens. It happens all the time. All of that has an impact on the pay gap, is helping to fuel it. So I want to talk a little bit about how those disparities are working together and how we can work against them. Some of the critical research that you and your partner organizations have done shows that there are still significant pay disparities between, for example, men and women, white workers and people of color, and especially between women of color and white men who do the very same job. And you all are probably familiar with the statistics, the census data showing that on average, as of 2015, women working full-time outside the home earn just 80 cents for every dollar earned by men. In 2015, we saw stats that were even worse for women of color. African American women earning only about 63 cents. Latinas, 54 cents, Asians about 85 cents, and Native American women were estimated to make just 58 cents for each dollar earned by a white male in a typical year of full-time employment. And these pay gaps exist in just about every occupation in every state. They widen over time. Thanks to the excellent research by IWPR, we know, unfortunately, that it's probably going to take about 40 years to completely close those gender pay gaps. I don't know about any of you, but I don't plan to still be working 40 years from now. So I hope that we can at least agree we need to move a little faster on this. Some of them, of course, are explained by differences in industry and occupation, but even when you take these factors into account, even when you control or do regression analysis for the lawyers in the room and the economists in the room, you end up with unexplainable pay gaps. And I want to be clear, in addition to the pay discrimination, another important cause of this pay gap that we're seeing is the refusal of many employers to hire women into jobs occupied traditionally by men. I'm talking about the construction worker jobs. I'm talking about the jobs that are traditionally male, like construction, like manufacturing, and a lot of our STEM jobs. We've been working very hard to eliminate steering that is based on sex stereotypes about who can do what job and what their work is worth. This form of discrimination has huge economic ramifications. I'll give you just one example. We had a case against Outback Steakhouse restaurant, which, you know, you've probably heard about it. They had a pattern of practice of they'd hire women, but not promote them into those higher level profit-sharing management positions that are so critical, right? So when we got it together and finally got a settlement, it was $19 million that they had to set aside, right? We're not talking about small amounts of money. And these things are not in the employer's interest. They're certainly not in society's interest. We also see all the time that you have these things coming together, the steering and the pay discrimination. So there are very few employers in these traditionally male jobs that if they do hire women, will give them the same money that her male counterparts are earning. Just this week, we announced a settlement. It's a case that I've been watching, even though it's just an individual case, for a while, on behalf of a woman called Joanna Smith in the traditionally male field of civil engineering. She was hired by Prince George's County of Environment, 5 years of experience, excellent record, tried to negotiate a salary that she thought would match her experience in education, and was rebuffed. 2 weeks later, they hire a male engineer, same position, same duties, for more money. He's allowed to negotiate. To make it worse, the employer also paid 2 other engineers, one of whom was junior to her with less complex duties, more than they paid Joanna. So, not surprising, we were able to win that case. We got a ruling from the federal judge. I don't know why it had to go to court in the first place, but okay. That this violated the Equal Pay Act. And we resolved it. We got about $145,000 in damages, but here's the kicker. $25,000 they had to up her salary for the going forward part. Imagine what it means to be shorted $25,000 a year, okay? You know what that means? That means you're getting less in Social Security, you're getting less in pensions and retirement savings, right? If you're at an employer that has a bonus system, you're getting less in your bonuses. What women take home is so important to their families, to our economy, and to the basic fairness that's at the bottom of everything this country is supposed to stand for. And I think we do stand for. So I was able to catch the last conversation about sexual harassment. It's a big problem. I know we're running short on time, and I want to just be very clear. This is something that's also fueling this pay gap, right? If a woman has to leave, she's denied that promotion because of sexual harassment, we have got to get our arms around it. And I cannot leave without saying that obviously this is an assault on human dignity, right? Obviously that's the big problem with it. Unfortunately, we have in a lot of our cases involving immigrant and migrant women, it's actually an assault, a criminal assault by the time it gets to us. There's 2 specials that I'll commend to you that PBS has done about EEOC's work in this area. The titles speak for themselves. One is called Rape in the Fields, about immigrant worker women. The other is called Rape on the Night Shift, about women who are working as janitors alone, cleaning a floor, and the only person who knows about them is the supervisor who, at least in our case out in LA, turned out to have a rape conviction, which the employer knew about before they hired him. So, huge problem. I commend to you, I'm not going to go on about it, but we have 2 of my colleagues, the current acting chair, who is a Republican, but she's very committed to this issue, and a Democratic colleague of mine, Hy Feldblum, have together made a report to the commission that we have followed up on. So we've got harassment guidance that was proposed for comment. It will be coming out soon. We also have, they have very practical suggestions about warning signs and prevention in their report. And so it is a very hands-on kind of report. So I actually, like that report better than our collective guidance, which is a little bit more lawyerly, but I commend that to you. Last thing I want to mention, fueling the pay gap, caregiver discrimination. Caregivers, it's amazing to me that everybody doesn't get that, but we actually have employers who not only do they not embrace some of the excellent proposals that I know you all are championing, like sick leave, more flexible workplace, but they actually discriminate against caregivers, making assumptions about who can do what and why, even before you're hired. So I just wanted to make sure that you all know that the EEOC has a guidance on this as well, that talks about when that actually violates your civil rights laws, right? So if you assume that you can't promote the woman because she's got a preschool age child, it's a problem. And we've been doing some cutting edge work in litigation, got a good settlement in a case called Timken, which really it was an ADA case, but talked about, you can't fire a woman, or deny her hire rather, because she has a child with a disability. More qualified than the people you selected, everything else, but she has a child with a disability, and so you decide she can't do the job. That was one of our cases. We also have done some precedent-setting work in the Fifth Circuit, of all places, to establish that discrimination against nursing mothers violates the civil rights laws. Very excited about those cases. So we are going to continue with this as our top priority, and I want to say we spent a lot of time last year on a very important proposal to collect pay data so that we would have more information, be more informed, be better able to focus our resources. From those employers that have 100 and more employees, we have traditionally collected data on demographics, race, national origin, gender, since 1966. But we decided that what we really needed to add to that was information about salary. And so we spent a long time, you know, two public announcements, 2 sets of comments that we took very seriously, a day-long hearing that I was lucky to have IWPR appear at and present testimony and assist us with, and came up with a proposal that I think will work. It has some detractors. I've heard some say, hey, there is no pay discrimination, so why are you looking for this, and why should employers have to worry about that? I'll spare you my response to that. I've also heard people say, look, this snapshot of pay data is never going to tell you everything you need to know to bring a case, right? So let's make the perfect the enemy of the good. No, I believe firmly that based on the work that we've done looking carefully at this proposal and trying to balance that burden with what would really be useful, considering all the other information that we're able to get when we investigate, that this will be a very useful tool. So I hope you'll agree that it's worth having a little bit more information so we can finally close that pay gap. So it's not 40 years, but sometime a lot sooner before we have equal pay in the workplace. And we're still looking at all those other forms of discrimination too, of course, because I want to just say we don't have to accept the status quo. We don't have to accept the assumptions that women have always been paid more. You've already moved the needle, you, all of you, by shining a light on the need for equal pay and equal justice for women. And putting these issues at the forefront, we can actually have a national conversation, the kind of national conversation that creates a consensus to have real change. So paraphrasing Barbara Jordan once more, I have no doubt that your efforts in educating the public will lead us to economic and political empowerment. So let's continue the fight. And I wish you a very successful conference and look forward to future collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Burrows. It's just so inspiring to see what you've done and what you're continuing to work on in your position, and to know that you have 20 years left in your career and so much more to do. I vote for you. Unfortunately, the commissioner does have to leave, so we don't have time for questions, but we do have time for lunch. So we're going to adjourn here, and we can talk to each other about the charge that she's given us to continue to educate and to tackle some of these issues that she's raised for us so eloquently. Thank you.